Okay, so that is well struck, but way too high. 7,500 almost RPMs of spin on a 7-iron is more than pretty much anyone should need. Launch angle is slightly higher than we need, and the spin is a lot higher. With that amount of ball speed, theoretically, we could be hitting that 7-iron probably more like 10 yards longer. So one of the first things people often ask me is, I hit my irons too high. Can I change the flight with a stiffer shaft? I feel like the shafts I'm using are too whippy. They're too flexible, they're too light, they're not stiff enough in the tip profile. Can I change my iron flight significantly with shaft change? Now, the answer isn't no, but it's not usually as much as people might think. So I'm going to switch to something considerably more stiff, not just in flex designation, but also in profile and actually heavier in weight as well. So a significantly different shaft here. So absolutely nothing has changed in the iron head itself, the loft, the lie angle, the golf ball, the length of the shaft, everything, just the actual shaft itself. And interestingly, also with a very good strike, you will see that the flight is really not that different. The red flight is the first shaft, the more soft and flexible shaft. The second flight is the stiffer profile shaft. And yes, it is a little bit lower in flight. The first shaft, launch angle was just under 20. Spin, as we mentioned, was quite high. Switch to the other shaft. We got basically almost the exact same amount of spin, very similar strike. Sure, it came down a slight amount, but certainly not as much as we might expect. Now, I'm certainly not saying that the shaft is not doing anything, because that is far from being the case. Obviously, the shaft is very significant when it comes to controlling strike points, controlling face stability, face to path relationships, how often we get that back to a square relationship to the path that we're presenting. Very, very important. And obviously, yes, there will be differences in dynamic loft. There will be differences in how the shaft launches and spins, but they're just not quite as much as people might expect, especially when you're close enough in steel. Sure, if we went to the most flexible graphite that I could find and the stiffest steel that I could find, there'd probably be a wider dispersion here. But I just want someone to look at this and go, I'm considering reshafting my set and hoping to bring my iron flight down significantly. And I think, as you can see, that's not necessarily going to happen. So a bigger change you can make for a lot less money and a lot less commitment is changing the golf ball. So those first few shots I hit were with a Pro V1X. That is, let's call it a fairly high spin ball when it comes to the irons and the wedges. I'm just going to switch into a Pro V1 here, which is lower spin in the irons. It's not a low spin ball per se, but it's not quite as high spin as Pro V1X is. Okay, so I think that's about as close as I can do. Strike was very similar. Swing, path, and angle of attack were very similar. That is a drastically different spin number there. Very similar delivered loft to what we talked about in the previous shot with Pro V1X. Very similar swing, direction, and angle of attack. And launch angle is not all that different either, but the spin rate is significantly down. That is almost, well, it's just over 700 RPMs of spin. So shaft to shaft, sure, we got it down 100 or so RPMs. Not all that much, if we're being fair. When I switch to a lower spin, let's call it golf ball construction, I change that iron flight by 700 RPMs. Now, I'm going to go back to the original golf ball, and I'm going to show you what happens when we just take a little bit of static loft off the iron head. So when we're switching between shafts, the goal really, if I want to knock my flight down with a shaft change, I need the shaft to help the head deliver less loft. Now, when we tested between these two shafts, I didn't really see a whole lot of difference there. We only really made a very subtle difference between the two. Now, more shots, you know, robot tests might expose, sure, there is, of course, a difference between these two, but functionally, we want to actually make this ball flight change. We need the actual loft at impact to change. So the easiest thing to do would be to work with an iron head with less loft in construction, or you take your iron head and take a little bit of loft off of it. So this is 2 degrees less loft than where we started. Everything else is exactly the same, including the golf ball. Ball speed, higher, spin, much lower, carry, more. Now you can see the actual dynamic loft numbers come down by about 2, which makes sense because we have 2 degrees less static loft. Let's go back to before. Different head. We have a similar swing, but we have more dynamic loft, so we have more spin. So if we're going to swing exactly the same, but only the dynamic loft changes, we get less spin and more carry. A little bit lower launch angle as well. A little bit more ball speed as well. If we're only going to change the golf ball, we deliver the same amount of loft, but we have less spin as well. So there's two options there. If you want to hit it with less spin, a little bit further, you can either get a little bit less loft on the iron itself, or you can switch to a golf ball that spins a little bit less. So back to the original shaft, head, and golf ball that we started with. Your final option, if you want to change your iron flight, is to make some changes to the actual golf swing. So most of the time when someone has a bit of a spinnier flight, we are probably a little weak with the lead wrist condition. So let's just say a slightly cupped or open face relationship at the top. And we are often adding loft through impact, through a little bit of a flipping motion. So this little device is called the Watson Hanger. I use it a lot in here with clients. It's extremely effective at getting the lead wrist a little bit more flexed at the top, so a little bit more of a flat or slightly bowed position, which has the face in a lot stronger position. And it also, if you can maintain contact with the hanger through impact, will help you add a little bit of shaft lean. Now, what both of those things are doing are making the dynamic loft at impact less. So less dynamic loft at impact, as we can see, is really the key to changing the flight of your irons. I'm going to see if I can get my dynamic loft down to where it was with the stronger lofted iron, just through technique. Pretty interesting. So I got my dynamic loft down by a couple degrees there. Similar path and angle of attack, but you can see I've actually, through technique, gotten my dynamic loft down quite a bit. Now, I did hit it a little bit thin on that particular strike, so the spin is a little bit higher than we saw when we just had less static loft with a better strike, lower spin. However, this is a pretty good example of how you can get your spin and dynamic loft down just using technique, better wrist conditions, and a little bit more shaft lean at impact. So if we kind of want to wrap that up and prioritize how we would make a change, also what would be the easiest thing to change, the shaft is the one that probably isn't going to change the launch and spin quite as much as we think. Now, again, I'm not saying the shaft is not important. It is extremely important for suiting your tempo, your timing, your strike location consistency, your face to path consistency. A lot of things are very important to get right with the shaft. However, when it comes to actually changing the launch and spin of the ball, it doesn't do quite as much as you think. The golf ball does a ton. It's easily the easiest thing you can change. You just switch to a lower spin golf ball off the irons and you're going to change your flight significantly right away. You can also work with less static loft. So if you're using a pretty traditional lofted club like I've got here, you can either have them adjusted a little bit stronger, nothing wrong with that, or you can go with a set of irons that just starts with a little bit less static loft to begin with. So I was using T100s, I used a T150. And certainly last but not least is technique. If you are someone that has a little bit of the cupped wrist at the top, the open face at the top, and then you have the lovely flipping action at the bottom, you could do yourself a lot of good by getting the wrist in a much better position at the top and some shaft lean through impact. You're going to deliver less loft and change your flight quite a lot.